Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Welcome back, students. This is the second part of our literature and ethics session, and we look at the ethical side of research in this session. Well, whenever you're doing research, a major concern that you will have to address before designing your study is its ethics part. It may be very difficult to appreciate fully what ethical dilemmas you can face during your research until you are doing your research. But waiting until the middle of doing a study is too late. It may actually annul your study after you've invested so much time and effort into it. So you must look into the ethical side of your research at the start of designing your research. Uh, the idea to prepare and consider ethical concerns as you design your study is that you can build sound ethical practices into your research design, and if later a question arises, you can actually present your design of the study in which the ethical part was concerned, and if even if there was a lapse from someone else's perspective, you can demonstrate that from your own perspective you had covered all the ethical parts that you considered were important. What exactly ethics is in research? Well, we generally know that uh, outside research, ethics means a set of morals that concern a particular situation. And we also note that there are very few ethical absolutes. I mean, my ethics would be different from your ethics or another person's ethics. But still, there are many agreed upon principles that everybody would consider to follow while doing a particular thing, and that is what we call ethics in a particular area. And in research, ethics would be all the concerns, the dilemmas, the conflicts that arise over the proper way to conduct research. Basically, ethics defines what is or is not legitimate when you are doing your research, or simply, what are the morals of research. So, I can understand that at this moment you may not be able to appreciate fully what ethics is. So, we will look at a few examples of studies that had ethical dilemmas or controversies. We'll look at other aspects of ethics from harm to participants' perspective, from their privacy perspective, from the perspective of larger interests of the society and the scientific community. So you should be able to really grasp the concept once we go into the detail. But first of all, we need to discuss why should we be ethical while doing research. Well, I think that the answer to this question is pretty what we call it goes without saying. Nobody would believe your research until you are ethical about it, because a person who won't look at ethics of a research, well, he or she may not be reporting things correctly. He or she may be putting the wrong data in. So ethics has to be there. The ethical concerns must be important for all the researchers to, as a first step, prove that they did a good research that should be reliable. So there are a few definitions that we must look at. First is scientific misconduct. What is scientific misconduct? It's misconduct from a scientific community's perspective, and it includes things such as research fraud, plagiarism, or other unethical conduct that significantly deviates from the accepted practices for doing research as established by the scientific community. What is research fraud? It would be basically faking your data or falsely reporting on the research procedures. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is claiming something to be yours when it is not, which would include copying from others without citing them, which would include citing too much from somebody with the even if you're citing it. So there are many details of plagiarism which we would be discussing throughout this course, but generally it is about using someone else's work and representing it as your work. Another concern when you're looking at ethical side of research would be that there would be things that would be legal, but they would be crossing the lines of ethics. For example, if a study is copyrighted, obviously you cannot take material from it. It would be an illegal thing to do, and the owner of study can actually take you to the court. But what if the research of the other person is not copyrighted? It is not even published. You just saw it in a raw form and you picked it. It's obviously not illegal, but it is surely unethical. So, as a researcher, not only should we be aware of, we should not only be sure of not doing illegal things, but also not doing unethical things. So, from the perspective of ethics and participation in research, an important concept is the concept of harm or causing harm to the participants. Why would, from where did this concept of protection of the participants came? Well, it's the first instance of this is seen in literature in connection with the medical experiments that were conducted by Nazi researchers, and they ultimately led to the development of Nuremberg Code. We'll discuss what Nuremberg Code is, but the concept it came forth when the Nazi soldiers who were they were self-proclaimed researchers. They would conduct research on prisoners, and it would actually include things like exposing them to deadly gases, severing their limbs, and giving them really serious physical torture, which would even lead to their death. And the cover would be that we are doing medical experiments to see what this gas does. So before that time, there was no worldwide code for doing research. So you could not really hold them to account because they were legally speaking doing nothing wrong. They were doing experiments. Another source which actually led to development of laws related to protection. They were the Tuskegee syphilis study and related experiments. It was also called bad blood. What happened in these studies was they actually started before penicillin was available or was invented and made public. Penicillin was a drug that would become one of the very initial antibiotics, and syphilis wasn't treatable until the first antibiotic came in. So these studies they were conducted on uneducated poor African Americans to see what kind of disabilities they come with advanced stages of syphilis. Now you have a patient who has syphilis, and during your experiment, penicillin was available in the market, or during your experiment, it just became available in the market, but you did not give it to your patients because they were under an experiment. So these kind of things that were actually legal, strictly speaking legal, but they were highly unethical. They created a need for for worldwide concern on such issues, and for some code about doing the research, and that code should somehow bind the researchers to follow a certain set of ethics. So, what is harm? A harm to a research participant? It could be seen from a physical perspective. Harming somebody physically is obviously there's no way a research could allow this. Then there's a legal aspect of harming. Uh, there could be any perspective um, of legal harm. It could be, of course, in extreme cases, death, pain, disability, a loss of ability or freedom, loss of pleasure. It could be anything that legally harms somebody. It may not be a physical harm, but legally it could be harm. Well, anxiety to somebody, discomfort to somebody. When you ask them to recall unpleasant experiences, it is actually harm. Negative effect on a person's job could be harm if you ask them questions that could later lead to problems in their job. So harm is really a broad concept, and while doing your research, you should be very aware of all possible kinds of harms that could be inflicted upon your participants if they become part of your research. Well, the examples that we've cited so far, they are mostly from the medical side or the physical harm side, and some of you who intend doing social sciences research would be thinking, how could I harm my participants? I'm not going to inflict any pain on them or cause them any distress or something. But if you think deeply, some of your questions might actually be, uh, well, if your participants they answer your questions completely and with all their effort, it could be in some way harmful to them. For example, it could be harmful for them in their jobs if it is published with their names. So you should be really, really considerate about your participants, and you should be ready to ensure that no harms comes their way just because they participated in your research. Now we'll look at three very famous ethical controversies that are associated with research experiments that were conducted. um, in most of them were conducted around the middle of the last century. The first one was, it is known as Milgram's obedience study. Now, what is this study? If you look at the diagram at the right top corner of this slide, there are three people sitting. Uh, E is the experimenter, T is the teacher, and L is the learner. So Stanley Milgram, he devised his psychological study to answer a question related to uh, the Nazi forces, the German Nazi forces. And the question was that, was it possible that the Nazis and their accomplices or the followers, they did what they did only because they were following orders, and they did nothing wrong because they were following orders? So this was the question. And how was this set up? The experimenter E, he would order uh, the teacher who was the subject of this experiment, to give what the teacher would believe are painful electric shocks to the learner L, who is actually an actor or a confederate. The subject is led to believe that for each wrong answer, the learner was receiving actual electric shocks, though in reality there was no such punishments. Being separated from the subject, the confederate or the learner, he had set up a tape recorder integrated with the electric shock generator, which played pre-recorded sounds of him shouting for each shock level. So basically, what was happening? The teacher was asking questions from the learner, and if the learner would answer the questions wrongly, the teacher would give him or her an electric shock. And as the number of wrong answers increased, the the voltage of the shock would increase. And what the experimenter was doing, he was prodding the teacher to do the experiment and continue with it, irrespective of the of the feelings that he or she would have from the shouting that was coming from the learner. So basically, orders of the experimenter being followed by the teacher were being studied. And though it's not it's not our subject, but the outcome of this experiment was that Milgram, or the experimenter, he concluded that even the best kind of people, the normal people, they would do bad things only because they were ordered to do those things. So order in that sense was something that would kind of override the moral principles of the individual. Now, what is the controversy here? The controversy was that even though Milgram had obtained informed consent from the subjects, that was the teacher, he was still ethically responsible to ensure their well being. When participants displayed signs of distress, such as sweating, trembling, the experimenter should have stepped up and halted the experiment, but he did not. So this experiment, it became really controversial in history of scientific experiments on the context of discomfort to the the person who is a participant of the research. The second study is the Humphrey's tea room trade study. You can look for it on the internet. It was basically about tracking male homosexuals in public toilet. It was conducted in UK. Why was it controversial? Because the researcher Humphrey, uh, he misinterpreted his identity and the intent, because the privacy of the subjects was infringed during the study. And actually, the study caused a major debate on privacy for research participants, and is now often used as an example of highly controversial social research. The bottom line, why is it controversial? Because it infringed upon the privacy of the participants. The third controversial study is known as Zimbardo's prison experiment, uh, conducted in Stanford University. Well, all these researches, they were conducted at really top of the line universities in the world. The first one, the Milgrams, it was conducted at Yale, one of the top universities in the world. Similarly, this one that we are talking about, Zimbardo's study, it was conducted in Stanford. So in 1971. The purpose of this study was to understand Zimbardo studies. Its purpose was to understand the development of norms and effects of roles, labels, and social expectations in a simulated prison environment, SPE, simulated prison environment. This study is also called SPE. So basically, what they did was that they chose normal subjects. Personality tests were conducted, and only normal people, purely normal people, were selected to participate. They made two groups. One was the prisoners group, and the second was uh, guards group. So it was a simulated prison in which some people were guards and some people were to act as guards, and some people were to act as prisoners. The prisoners, they were deemed individualized, which means they were dressed in standard uniforms and they were called by their numbers. And the guards they were militarized, which means they were given uniforms, they were given sticks, they were given reflective sunglasses. So the guards, they were given orders to maintain a reasonable degree of law and order, and they served an 8-hour shift. And the prisoners, they were locked up 24 hours a day. Unexpectedly, the volunteers, all the participants, they became too caught up in their roles. The prisoners, they became passive and disorganized, while guards, they became aggressive, they became arbitrary, and they became dehumanizing. By the sixth day, things got so bad that Zimbardo had to call off this experiment for ethical reasons. Now, why is this a controversy? It is a controversy because participants were not allowed to leave the experiment. Secondly, uh, two French researchers, they wrote articles about it. They criticized this study very seriously on the grounds that they thought the participants, they knew the response expected from them or the behaviors expected from them, and they produced those behaviors. So what they say is that it was technically not a scientific study at all. It was it Zimbardo did it for no scientific reasons, and the sample was too small. So another controversy, and the basis of it being controversial is that the participants, they knew what to do, and they were kind of pushed to do what they were supposed to do. So these three uh, ethical controversies or researches that are regarded as controversial researches, they bring forth some really important aspects that every researcher should consider, uh, that basically relate to the well-being of the people who participated in your research. And that well-being could be from a physical harm perspective, it could be from a mental or a perceived harm perspective, it could be from the perspective of their privacy, and so on. So the basic idea is that uh, the participants of the researcher or the subjects, they are to be protected from all possible harms. Okay, so let's take another small break, and let's get back in 5 minutes and continue our discussions.